Hi, my name is Clara. I'm a mental health therapist in private practice, and I love helping other therapists start their private practices. One of the areas of practice ownership that I think is one of the most daunting and scary, and one that we know the littlest about as therapists, is HIPAA compliance in our private practice. So when we're starting our private practices, there's always so much that we need to do. There's a checklist of items ranging from getting an accountant to figuring out whether or not we want to have an office. And one of the most important things that you need to make sure to do as a private practice owner is to make sure that your practice is HIPAA compliant and that it's in line with the laws and regulations that you need to follow with HIPAA. So one of the things that I love to consult with other therapists on is HIPAA compliance, and I'm going to make it easy for you today with this video. In this video, I'm going to share my top 10 tips for maintaining HIPAA compliance in your small to medium-sized private practice. Tip number 1, have a notice of privacy practices. This is one you probably already know a little bit about. If you are a therapist who's delivering direct therapy or healthcare services to clients, you've probably seen this before. The notice of privacy practices for a lot of therapists is attached to their informed consent document. It's part of their intake packet that they give to new clients. So it is important to know, though, what is necessary to be included in the notice of privacy practices and what are some of the procedures that you must follow with the notice of privacy practices. Some of the important content that you need to have in your notice is you need to explain the individual or the client's rights to their PHI. PHI refers to protected health information. I am going to use the shorthand PHI throughout this video to refer to it. It means any health information of the patient or the clients that is individually identifiable for that patient. So anything that's attached to their medical records would be considered patient health information, protected health information. You also need to describe your entity, your practice's duties and responsibilities in managing PHI, as well as the uses and disclosures of PHI that your practice would conduct. So a use and disclosure of PHI could be something like we need to tell the insurance company that we bill through if you are using insurance to pay for sessions that we are treating you, and this is the information that we would be including in that release. So you need to briefly describe the uses and disclosures as well. You also need to give this document, the Notice of Privacy Practices, to every client that you see, as well as obtain a signature from that client attached to the Notice of Privacy Practices, an acknowledgement that they have read and they understood the Notice of Privacy Practices. The notice must also be posted on your website. This is something that I think sometimes is missed. You have to post the Notice of Privacy Practices on your website for anyone to see, and you also need to display it prominently in your office space if you have an in-person office space. Lastly, you must make the notice available to all clients. You must tell clients when the notice is updated, and then you also need to make sure to update it as needed as your policies change, and you need to send out a notice of the privacy practices, or at least an explanation of how to obtain the notice every 3 years. Tip number 2 is designate a privacy officer for your practice. So the names privacy officer and security officer are kind of interchangeable. In this video, it does get more complicated once you have a bigger practice, but you do need to designate what is called a privacy officer or security officer, which means it's the member of your team in your practice that is the main go-to person for HIPAA-related concerns. So for small to medium-sized private practices, this would likely be the practice owner. They would likely be a good person to have as the HIPAA privacy officer that's designated for your practice. The privacy officer may delegate roles to other workforce members in your practice as needed, but their main obligations are, again, to be the point person for all HIPAA-related inquiries and any sort of tasks that must be done for HIPAA compliance. And this includes fielding complaints, responding to any HIPAA-related incidents, and also enforcing regulations in your practice. All workforce members, employees should know who the privacy officer is, how to contact them, and what their role is within the practice. Tip number 3, have a HIPAA policies and procedures manual for your practice. This is one of the most important things that you can do for your practice to maintain HIPAA compliance. The policies and procedures manual is the home base for everything related to HIPAA for your practice. It is a document that outlines every policy and every procedure that you have that you are doing to maintain HIPAA compliance in your practice. So it can range in scope depending on the size of your practice. I would say some people have as few as a few pages if they have a very small practice, and it can range up to 30 pages, 40 pages, and even more if it's a large scale practice or if it's a large health care organization. The main features of this include an explanation of the standards and regulations, the policies on authorizations to release records and release protected health information in your practice, your notice of privacy practices, individual rights to patient health information, protected health information, breach notification, information on your security risk assessment, safeguards that you have in place to protect PHI, complaint policies and procedures on sanctions, business associates, and how you manage your documentation related to HIPAA. So all of those things, which is everything really that you need to be doing for HIPAA compliance, is located in the Policies and Procedures Manual. It should be a hub for everything if someone has a question about HIPAA that they can turn to. And it is supposedly one of the first things that the HHS would ask for in a practice if there was an audit related to HIPAA in your practice. They would ask for your Policies and Procedures Manual. So it is really important to have something in place like this. Additionally, all workforce members and employees should have access to the Policies and Procedures Manual just for reference, and updates should be made as needed as policies and procedures change in your practice. Tip number 4, conduct an annual security risk assessment for your practice. This is another big one. So in addition to the Policies and Procedures Manual, I would argue that the security risk assessment is another essential piece of HIPAA compliance in a private practice. It is an assessment tool and a procedure that you would do, again, annually or as needed. If you have a breach or something that happens that is a threat to HIPAA compliance, you would need to update your security risk assessment. And if something significant changes in your policies or procedures, then you would also need to update this assessment. But most of the time, it's an annual thing. You are required to do it annually in regards to the HIPAA law. So what this security risk assessment contains is that it identifies threats to PHI. It helps you analyze the risk of these threats to PHI in your practice specifically, and it allows you to break down and remediate these risks through security measures and into manageable steps for responding to them in your private practice. So this can take the form of a spreadsheet or a document, and the HHS website, the Health and Human Services website, actually has some free resources for this as well. They have a spreadsheet with some formulas attached that allow you to identify risks and threats to PHI in your private practice. So another important factor of the security risk assessment is that it also encourages you to take inventory of all of your office spaces and devices. So one of the important steps to maintaining HIPAA compliance is to make sure that you know and have inventory of all of the vehicles or technological devices that will be transmitting or using PHI. And every year when you complete your security risk assessment, or more often as needed, you should be conducting an inventory of all of the devices that you have within your practice that would be touching PHI. So this shows that you are continually monitoring HIPAA compliance in your practice to do the security risk assessment. So it shows that you're really invested in HIPAA compliance and that you're invested in following the rules and regulations that are set. Tip number 5, conduct an annual HIPAA training for your workforce members. So training is required annually or as needed when changes or updates occur according to HIPAA law. And if you don't have workforce members or employees, you can include a statement about this not being necessary in your Policies and Procedures Manual. However, if you do have employees or anyone that's working for you, such as a counseling intern or even an office manager or administrative assistant, in your practice, you do need to conduct annual training for your workforce. So training in areas of high risk should be prioritized, and it should cover the main HIPAA policies and procedures that the employee or the workforce member must follow as it pertains to their role in their job. It should also include clear training on what are the roles and responsibilities and how much interaction with PHI are you allowed to have with your role. So for instance, as an office manager, you should be granted access to only what amount of PHI is necessary for you to conduct your job. So perhaps only the billing information or perhaps demographic information in order to schedule appointments. However, you should not have access to the clinical notes, any sort of psychological assessments, or more in-depth clinical information on a specific patient or client. And then on the flip side, for a counseling intern, for instance, or an employee who's a counselor or a therapist, they shouldn't have access to other therapists' notes or client information. So that is an important piece of the training that must be covered as part of the overall HIPAA training. Tip number 6, have policies in place for authorizations to release records. So another name for this is a release of information, which most of us are probably familiar with as therapists. So any disclosures of PHI are not permitted by law unless there is an authorization in place or a release of information for the release of protected health information. There are requirements according to HIPAA law of what is included in your authorizations to release records. And I would also encourage you to check your state laws here too, because sometimes those can differ. Some of the things that you must include, though, include a description of the information being disclosed, information about who it's being disclosed to and about, an expiration date, a patient's signature, and statements about the patient's rights, among some other details. Like any other HIPAA documents, these need to be kept for 6 years at least, any sort of authorizations documentation for release of records. Tip number 7, implement administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. So what this means is you need to do practical things in your practice to maintain HIPAA compliance. So your policies and procedures manual is going to be a great place for you to list these and describe them in more detail. A lot of the things on this list of safeguards are administrative safeguards in the policies and procedures manual. Some example of physical safeguards include having locks on your doors, making sure PHI isn't left out for other people to see, unauthorized people, making sure that PHI isn't removed from the office location, having soundproofing mechanisms, etc. Some examples of technical safeguards include having passwords and two-factor authentication set up on all devices, not using public Wi-Fi to access PHI, having policies and procedures in place to transmit electronic PHI, conducting audits for your online systems, along with other items. So having clearly defined safeguards for your workforce members are going to be really important in maintaining HIPAA compliance, because as much as you understand as a private practice owner, and you're probably more likely to be a bit more on the ball with HIPAA compliance and in general with the duties related to practice ownership. So it is really important, again, through the HIPAA training for your workforce members to identify the safeguards that they must be doing to protect PHI. Because if your workforce members aren't protecting PHI, then you are not maintaining HIPAA compliance. So the safeguards, outlining them in detail and really explaining them to your workforce members is a really great way to maintain HIPAA compliance. Tip number 8, keep a list of business associates and have business associate agreements in place. A business associate is an outside entity or organization that helps manage PHI on your behalf in your practice. So business associates who deal with PHI should be inventoried as part of your security risk assessment, and you should make sure that you have a signed BAA agreement on file for all of them. Sometimes the BA gives you a stock BAA, and this is okay. Other times it's unique, and that's better if it's unique for you, your practice, and the business associate that you are working with. However, just know that sometimes for some business associates, it is normal to have just a general business associate agreement that they send to you. Some common examples of business associates include your email or phone provider for your practice, your electronic medical record system, your teletherapy provider, and your healthcare clearinghouses. Tip number 9, know what is feasible for your practice as it relates to HIPAA compliance, but also have policies in place just in case. So all of the above things that I have mentioned that help maintain HIPAA compliance are required by law for any sort of healthcare practices. It is recommended to have all of these things in place as a small to medium-sized private practice. However, remember that the scope of them depends on the feasibility for your practice. So meaning if you have training for one person versus training for 100 people, security measures that you take for a private home office versus a public co-working space, resources that you have to spend on HIPAA compliance for a solo practice versus a large corporation with a HIPAA team. All of these levels of HIPAA compliance are going to depend on the scope and the feasibility for your practice. It is okay to be a small to medium-sized private practice and not have a lot of resources for HIPAA compliance, and that is okay. You just need to make sure to identify them and show that you are thinking about HIPAA compliance and prioritizing it as you are able for the scope of your practice. The last tip I have for you is to regularly review relevant laws and regulation changes for HIPAA compliance for private practices. So there are state and national laws that discuss HIPAA and that pertain to HIPAA compliance. And it is important to review these as they change and as they're updated. So when you have a security risk assessment or a policies and procedures manual for your practice, that is a good example of something that you would need to update if there was a significant change to HIPAA law, either statewide or nationally. One really good way to keep up to date on HIPAA law is to sign up for the Department of Health and Human Services privacy listserv and security listserv. So these listservs are available on their website, and you can sign up through email, and it will deliver email blasts to you probably twice a month or every week or so with any sort of relevant HIPAA law or regulation changes for the profession. So that's a really great way to more passively absorb information about where the laws and regulations are changing for HIPAA. So I hope this video has been helpful for you to gain some knowledge about HIPAA compliance for your private practice. And if you have any more questions or if you're in need of any more guidance on what to do to maintain HIPAA compliance, I encourage you to either reach out to me, contact me, or check out my website for more free and paid resources on how to maintain HIPAA compliance for your practice.